welcome to the 5th episode of Raybees Reviews, where we will be talking about Control. Releasing in 2019, Control was developed by Remedy Entertainment, the same guys that brought you the Max Payne and the Alan Wake series. While I never got around to playing either of these series, I decided to give Control a try after seeing some of its combat clips as well as the gameplay reveal of its new sequel coming out soon. And let me just tell you, it wasn't exactly what I expected, and not in a good way. Granted, the game does have some clear-cut strengths, with the combat definitely being the standout. I feel like there's just so many narrative inconsistencies, storytelling catastrophes, and just like overall visual jank that didn't really make me the biggest fan of this game. Actually guys, if I'm being honest, I was so done with this game by the time I finished it that I'm actually not even gonna bother playing the sequel. Maybe I'll change my mind like months or years down the line, but September 2026 is already packed with like Blood of the Dawnwalker and Onimusha coming out, and I absolutely cannot be bothered spending any more time within the Control universe. With all that being said, let's quickly go over how I rate my games. I'll be judging the game on 4 categories: narrative, sensory, game design, and finally subjectivity. Under the narrative portion, we'll have plot, characters, voice acting. Under sensory, we'll have visuals and then sound. Under game design, we'll cover combat, progression, and open world, and finish off with some subjective opinions and then close it out. Now, with all that being said, let's jump into the review, starting with the plot. The plot begins with our protagonist, Jessie Faden, arriving at the Federal Bureau of Control to look for her little brother, Dylan, since the voice in her head told her to do so. More on that later. We discover that Jessie and her brother were childhood victims of a paranatural incident that happened in their hometown of Ordinary, Maine. The FBC had intervened and written it off as an industrial accident and took Dylan in the process, with Jessie narrowly managing to escape. Upon arriving, she finds that the place is mostly deserted and makes her way through the office until she finds the dead body of the former director, Zachariah Trench, and picks up his weapon, making her the new director and gaining access to the board, a mysterious entity who give her supernatural powers and task her with clearing out the Hiss, an infestation that has taken over the building and has transformed the staff into armed zombies with supernatural powers. Overall, this premise was nice in theory, but not very well executed. I feel like it was a bit rushed and could have used a little bit more time in the pot to like marinate properly. The kind of story that Control is trying to tell really needs that slow tension build-up. This is something you're going to see me talk about throughout the review because it's a reoccurring problem within the game. The game generally moves through its plot beats a lot faster than necessary, and it ends up fumbling potentially heavy-hitting scenes later in the process. So anyway, getting back to the story, after she murks the zombies with a new heater, our girl finds some workers that haven't been infested by the Hiss because they're wearing these devices that make them resistant. Jessie still wants info on her little brother Dylan, so she agrees to rescue Marshall, who's the head of security and was part of the previous director's inner circle, who might have an idea of where Dylan is. This early to mid part of the plot is where the game peaks narratively. This is where the stakes fully get established on how dangerous the Hiss actually is, how it's basically like a mind virus that zombifies you while keeping your combat prowess, and how it's literally just like a ragtag group of people against an entire building of the Hiss infested. There's always this feeling that the Hiss can claim any single character in the story, which creates this seeping dread throughout the whole playthrough. I feel like the game is so good at using this eerie, uncomfortable silence to force narrative tension into the playthrough. Because come to think of it guys, you're essentially playing against armed zombies who have supernatural powers, and there's always this unease every time you open a door or turn a corner. The setting that you're trapped in, this empty and sterile FBC headquarters, also add a nice bit of environmental storytelling, because it really makes you feel alone during all of this, and like you really have to rely on both your wits and your powers to navigate through all of it. Anyway, using all the different objects of power she finds, which are basically like normal things infused with extremely powerful supernatural affinities, Jessie gains new powers and steamrolls her way to Marshall, who explains that Dylan is actually inside the FBC building and was originally groomed to become the next director because of the supernatural abilities he's awakened as a result of the incident. He eventually got moved to a top security prison after he lost control of his powers and ended up killing a bunch of workers. So, after finding this out, Jessie goes to this top secret prison where she finds that Dylan has actually succumbed to the Hiss, but instead of getting overtaken by it, he's maintained like some semblance of control and willingly surrendered himself to the Bureau with the rest of the survivors. Once Jessie gets back and has her long-awaited reunion with her brother, she discovers that his brain has been fractured completely by the Hiss and his conscience is slowly being overwritten, essentially making him like a mouthpiece for the Hiss. He reveals that the Hiss initially came into this world because of the same object of power that was responsible for the incident in their childhood. This object of power, a slide projector that Jessie, Dylan, and like some of the other neighborhood kids were playing with, was an extremely powerful object of power that opens interdimensional portals, and the two had activated it by accident, which is also what implanted the mysterious voice inside Jessie's head, which she refers to as Polaris. Alright, I have to say guys, this is where the story hits its first major problem. Dylan's long-awaited reveal is kind of fumbled in part due to the actor's horrific voice acting performance. We'll get into this later, but this scene really required the same kind of performance that like James McAvoy gave in the movie Split. But instead of that, we got the only bad performance in this entire game, and it completely destroyed the big emotional moment of the first half. Again, back to the rushed storytelling that I talked about earlier, I expected a little bit of an extended cutscene to like fully soak in the moment of this emotional reunion. Keep in mind, like this is like 17 years later before they first got separated. But again, due to like how rushed and like how like haphazard the storytelling can be in this game, it really felt like overall just kind of weird. It was such a weird reunion between the two, and it really just like put a damper on what was like an excellent tension building up to that moment. Alright, so back to the story. While she tracks down the slide projector, Jessie learns that Trench and the head of research, Dr. Darling, had used the slide projector to enter an alternate dimension where they discovered an extremely powerful paranatural entity called Hedron. Jessie tracks this Hedron around the building until she comes face to face with it, revealing it to be the physical body of the Polaris that's trapped inside her head. Immediately and conveniently after this discovery, Hedron is attacked by his zombies and destroyed. This causes Polaris' presence to disappear within Jessie, and after losing her North Star, she starts succumbing to the hiss and begins living out a reality where she must repeat the same mundane, powerless life of an office assistant over and over while delivering mail to Trench. As her mind is slowly being eroded, she learns that Trench was actually the first to be infected by the hiss during their expedition using the slide projector, and that Trench is the one that initially brought the hiss back with him to Earth. It's also revealed that under the hiss influence, Trench is the one that initially used the slide projector to open a portal to the hiss and then promptly killed himself, essentially starting the hostile takeover and leaving the FPC completely lost without its leader. In a completely idiotic and painfully convenient turn of events, Jessie managed to quote-unquote find a piece of Polaris within herself and uses that to break free of the hiss and assume full control of her powers again. She finds out that the Hiss are using Dylan's supernatural talent to break into the dimension where the board is in, threatening to take control of the whole bureau from the top down. In what I can only describe as one of the most boring climactic sequences I have ever witnessed, she fights off some random hiss grunts and reaches Dylan, cleansing him of the hiss and temporarily stopping the hijacking and saving the board, but leaving Dylan in a coma in the process. Right, okay, yeah. I'm going to give the plot of Control a fucking 4 out of 10. Recovering from the disastrous end to the first half, the story, for what it's worth, picks up in the second half with all the juicy details about the origins of the slide projector and how the hiss takeover actually started. One of the few good things about the plot is its pacing, and I can really never take anything away from that. It moves at a very brisk pace, and you're never feeling like a particular story point is dragging on too long or causing any sort of a narrative friction. On the opposite end of the spectrum though, the game routinely fails to deliver on the stakes that it massively builds up to. It makes this mistake time and time again. It's actually so annoying because, like I mentioned earlier, the tension building is one of the game's two biggest strong points, especially when it comes to like the narrative. The game perfectly captures the existential threat that the hiss represents, but the emotional payoffs as a result of that tension are completely fumbled. And I think a large part of this is because of the game director, Mikhail Kasurinin. See, in all of the interviews he's done surrounding the game, Mikhail has routinely cited Dark Souls as his influence in some of the narrative design implementations within Control. And for what it's worth, it is noticeable. We'll get into this later into the world design section, but there's tons of little collectibles you can find in terms of like case files or tape recordings that give you bits and pieces of contextual lore surrounding the events of the game. This is like very much Miyazaki's narrative delivery. Players sort of have to like piece together the plot themselves instead of having it narrated to them like a normal piece of media would. The real problem is that while Miyazaki can pull off this frankly dumbass narrative delivery structure, Mikhail completely fumbles it. There's a fine line between leaving things open-ended for player interpretation and just simply not providing the requisite context for some of the characters, to the point where I'm like completely disinterested in what happened to them. For example, I couldn't give a flying fuck what happened to Polaris or Hedron because the character was never really explored throughout the story. We know that it's Jessie's benefactor and the reason she's even in the FEC building in the first place, but the internal dialogue between Jessie and Polaris remain unknown for the players themselves, so it's really hard for me to establish some sort of like connection to Polaris, and I don't really give a fuck if she's destroyed because I don't really know much about her. There's too much mystery surrounding that character. I know that Mikhail is trying to channel his inner Miyazaki and come off as this like mysterious intellectual, but instead the story just feels like hollow and pedantic. He tries for this approach and fails horribly. Most of the ambient storytelling throughout all the case files and recordings function more like flavor text that feels time consuming rather than like immersive or illuminating about the details of the plot. And this is why the game really fucks up the landing on a narrative scale. It routinely undercooks key characters and then expects you to react as if the sky is falling when those characters are threatened in any sort of way. Imagine you went to a restaurant that served you like a barely cooked piece of steak, like fresh off the fucking cow, and expect you to like leave them a 5-star review. That's essentially what the Control plot is. There's so many other problems I can get into, like how Jesse's reveal as the P7, basically like another prime candidate who was deemed worthy to take over the bureau, was revealed so badly. This was such an important part of the story and explains a massive portion of the plot's initial premise and definitely deserves some kind of like big cutscene, but it's just there, like put in front of you. You just stumble into a room and you see all the pictures and recordings of the FBC tracking Jesse after the incident, revealing that Jesse also has extreme paranatural talent similar to her brother. This honestly makes so much sense given how she's able to quickly take over the director's magic gun and starts learning these extremely powerful paranatural abilities very quickly. Also, the final climax is a letdown. The story ending with Jesse taking down a bunch of ground enemies without a proper boss fight against Dylan or any other big boss was also like, it just felt bad. I feel like after all that, the most common sense thing to do was to have Jesse at least fight like a hiss-infested version of Dylan, which honestly would have earned it another point in this category, but no. Just clear the mobs and then click on Dylan to end the fucking game. Wonderful. So yeah guys, the plot of Control is severely undercooked, and it's especially frustrating since the game does a terrific job of building up the stakes and pacing throughout the plot, but like routinely chokes the ending. So yeah, 4 out of 10. By the way guys, that was a big ass section dedicated to just the plot, and we have like 9 more categories to get through. If y'all have stuck around this far and enjoying the review, consider this my time to beg for likes and subs. I like to reach more people about the actual state of this game before they get caught up in the hype and buy it before the sequel drops. If you guys disagree with any of my takes on the plot or anything else coming after this, let me know as well, and I can tell you why you're most likely wrong. Anyway, that's it for now, back to the video. Alright, let's move on to the character section of this review. Now, the main problem I have with the cast of the characters in Control is that they're underserved by a plot that doesn't really allow them to develop meaningfully. I feel like characters like Darling, Marshall, Emily, and Aarti are all decently good side characters. Darling's characterization is done well, and the actor that plays him does an excellent job. He serves as sort of like this info panel to give you an understanding of the world, but again, unfortunately, doesn't actually say anything meaningful aside from his final 2 recordings. Like I said earlier, most of his recordings are just time-wasting flavor text disguised as important context. Emily is cute and likable and serves as a convenient information dump, but really nothing more. There could have been more work done on to like explain her struggles with Darling and being marginalized or stuff like that, but of course we don't get a side quest like that. More on that later actually. Aarti is apparently a paranatural entity disguised as a janitor that helps Jesse in her missions in his own quirky ways and was honestly very interesting. Honestly wish we could have seen more of him because I feel like he was the only one with any sort of like compelling personality. And speaking of compelling personality, let's talk about Jessie herself. And honestly guys, I think she's kinda mid. She has this like plain Jane characterization whose only real motive seems to be to find her brother, and I feel like she almost takes down the hiss as an afterthought convenience of the whole plot. The thing that pisses me the most off about Jessie is how she talks to Polaris inside her head, which I already thought was weird, but alright. But again, the real problem is that you never really hear what Polaris is saying, so the whole time you're listening to a one-way conversation that just feels like weird. I can't describe to you how unsettling it is to constantly talk to something that isn't even properly revealed at the end. Again, this is like another attempt by Mikhail to mimic Miyazaki in some sort of like faux intelligent storytelling, but it just comes off idiotic. Her arc is also like fairly undercooked as well. Part of it isn't really her fault since the first half was tied to finding Dylan, and Dylan's voice actor single-handedly chokes away all of the intrigue and momentum that was built up. Her resolve to fully assume her position as the director and rid the bureau of the hiss sounds like really nice on paper, but it feels like a narrative convenience than a genuine transformation. There was no dialogue or anything else to suggest that she wanted anything to do with her new position outside of finding Dylan and destroying the side projector, so it just feels like she just flipped on a switch at the end, and it overall just felt like pretty inauthentic for the character. Regarding the rest of the characters, I obviously think the big reveal with Trench was ultimately the biggest punch, and it landed pretty well. Revealing that he had been the first to be infected and caused the hiss outbreak in the first place was a genuinely good twist, especially given how it was done with the fake post-credit scene to like throw off the player. That whole fake post-credit scene to emulate Jesse losing control is probably the only bit of like creative storytelling from the game, and it was genuinely, guys, like a stroke of genius. It obviously ultimately does very little to fix the massive issues in the other parts of the game, but hey, nice touch. Unfortunately though, outside of Jessie awkwardly coming into her own or Trench's big reveal, none of the other characters really went through any sort of like appreciable arc. I know Marshall goes through a big arc in the DLC, but I could not be bothered to finish that shit. I was already so happy finishing the main game and I am not going back. Overall, the one unifying positive among all the characters was actually the hiss itself. The antagonist remains the strongest narrative point in Control and is saving it from potentially catastrophic scores in this category. The mystery surrounding what it actually is, how it seems to affect people differently, where it even comes from, is the backbone of the entire plot of Control, and it provides ample conflict for the characters to develop against. Ultimately, they obviously don't, but it's still written well as like this mercurial and enigmatic antagonist. So off the back of how the hiss was presented, as well as Trench's big reveal and some passable characterizations for the side characters, I'll give the character section of Control a 5 out of 10. Moving on, we'll talk about the voice acting in this game, which turned out to be quite the pleasant surprise. Like I said earlier, the plot of Control really does depend on slow, marinated moments to charge up the big, emotional payoffs in critical junctures. Although the story premise has all the makings of a good story, it obviously fumbles the execution when it comes to like the payoffs and the arcs, and even stuff like the dialogue or janky animations that we'll get into later. But one aspect that really carried the shit out of the narrative is the incredible voice acting in this game. It honestly had no right being as good as it is. Every single character, except for this one, put on an absolutely stellar performance. Whether it's Emily's excitement, Darling's quirkiness, Marshall's no-nonsense, Trench's brooding, or just Jesse's overall delivery, the acting cast in Control really are trying their hardest to carry this plot. There's games like God of War or Red Dead 2, where the great voice acting elevate an already spectacular narrative journey. But I think this is one of the first times where I've played a game where the voice acting is so good that it actually hides a subpar plot and shitty dialogue. I really wish I could have given this section a perfect score, but of course fucking Dylan had to ruin it. Dylan was an enormous letdown given the narrative building leading up to him. This was an extremely important moment during the playthrough, given how, all throughout the first half, Jesse's primary motives weren't even necessarily stopping the hiss, but just reuniting with her brother after 17 long years. With him overtaken by the hiss and essentially suffering from a contorted MPD, Dylan had to communicate both the hiss corruption as well as some semblance of the real Dylan buried underneath all of that. But instead, we got this.
I wanted to say that they sound good. They make me feel good. Don't you want to say them too? No.
So yeah, 9 out of 10. With all that being said, let's move on from the narrative portion and focus on the sensory portion of the game, where the game kind of runs into even more problems. Let's start with the visuals first. Control generally has good graphical fidelity and polish. Its biggest accomplishment is the designing of the bureau building itself, which features a lot of really cool brutalist architectural designs. Honestly, this was such a nice touch, especially considering the fact that the bureau is supposed to symbolize this stability and control, which is like in direct contrast to the hiss and its more amorphous nature. And it's not even that, the game all in all has a very distinct architectural presence. For instance, the maze sequence was the obvious high point of the entire game and really showed off how Control's visual presentation can peak from a macro perspective. I also like the sheer attention to detail and minutia within the game. Even right down to the stuff like the letters on a random report that's just like sitting on a desk is done with like excruciating detail, which really makes the world feel alive, despite it being mostly empty of people. Unfortunately, despite its visual prowess in both its architecture and attention to detail, the visuals completely falls apart on the cinematic scale. The facial expressions in this game are really quite poor, and normally I wouldn't dock so many points for this, but again, this game is built on powerful emotions like yearning, reunion, chaos, confusion, death, so nailing these facial expressions are mandatory for bringing the script to life. Because if you read the plot of Control on Wikipedia, it sounds decent. I've been saying it from the beginning, but the game has a very powerful and compelling antagonist to carry the characters through the plot. However, due to the janky facial cutscenes, the plot never really lands. It always feels like a bit goofy and unserious, which is not a good thing given how serious the game takes itself. There were also other problems I had with just like the general color shading. I feel like my eyes eventually adjusted to the red, but I swear to God, it was just like bland as hell for the first few minutes and just like straight up ugly. That's one thing about this game, guys. This game is like kinda ugly for like 70% of its runtime. The lighting was off in like certain patches as well, and certain corners were so dark that I literally could not navigate through them. Another small nitpick, but something that honestly annoyed me, was the designs for the various materials in the game. It's little stuff like this that actually immerse you into the game and conveys an accurate role-playing feel. So I didn't like how these materials look like something I drew in math class in like the fucking 3rd grade. So overall, I'm going to give the visuals in Control a 4 out of 10. Its architectural feats and attention to detail aren't enough to save it from the horrible and at times just like straight up comically bad facial animations, which is one of the many reasons why the plot of this game never really landed like it was supposed to. Aside from specific moments, I just think this game is like pretty ugly for the most part, and looking back, it was actually one of the main reasons I was so happy to be finally fucking done with this game. Now with that out of the way, let's move on to the audio and sound section of the review, which is a kind of an interesting conversation. If I had to sum up the music in Control in one word, I'd probably use the word underutilized. While the general sound engineering of the game, from the audio layering to the sound effects during the combat and traversal, were all packaged nicely, I feel like the game was lacking in sort of like an auditory identity. Like during all the combat, I noticed that the music was like this kind of creepy, low burn tune. Granted, this works wonderfully for the general atmospheric scoring during exploration. Control is really about fighting like flying supernatural zombies with guns in an abandoned building all by yourself. So having this kind of creepy, apprehensive musical backdrop does wonders for letting the creepiness just seep in through your playthrough. The game is even good at using silence in these places as well, and it creates a nice extra bit of tension when the only thing you hear are the steps you're taking running down a hall, and you never know what's going to jump out at you at any moment. The thing is, guys, they nailed this creepy atmospheric build-up, but the problem is they didn't switch gears when it came to the combat itself. They used the same sort of creepy, dreadful tracks across the combat sequences, which felt really desynced with the experience. This is especially a damn shame given the combat is like literally the best part of the game. For an experience like that, I expected something a lot more rock and roll to get the blood pumping, but instead all we got was this like slow, creepy melody, which was straight up just like not the correct call here. For example, I don't know why they didn't just like remix the Old Gods of Asgard song that plays during the maze sequence. I think for anyone that's played the game, it's pretty unanimous that the maze sequence is the best part of the game, and it's literally the game doing everything right for a solid 5 minutes out of its like 15-hour runtime. The song is catchy and plays into the namesake of Control, and they could have easily remixed versions of this song into combat tracks and it would have absolutely slapped. So yeah, I guess it's a bit disappointing from the audio side of things. The game nails the creepy atmospheric scoring and the general sound engineering, but fumbles the ball when it comes to taking that one good peppy song in this game and turning it into like fun combat tracks. So I think overall, I think the audio in this game is just decent, so I'll be giving this a 5 out of 10. Moving on from the sensory stuff, let's discuss game design, starting with the combat. Now this is without a doubt the best part about Control. As I was playing through it, I kept thinking about how it reminded me of Hogwarts Legacy, just like fun, fast, and sleek, and that's when I realized that this game came out like 4 years before Hogwarts Legacy. The combat features traditional third-person shooter gameplay, augmented with psychokinetic spells. Aside from just like how fun the launch spell is and how sleek the gunplay is, I think what really surprised me was how much depth the combat really had. Every enemy is basically like a puzzle, and getting off certain spells will debilitate them, allowing you to gun them down or pelt them with like random shit lying around. It relies on cycling through the correct spells and positioning, as well as like the standard gunplay fundamentals like accuracy and peeking. The service gun that Jesse picks up at the start of the game can essentially morph into different archetypes, from shoddy to an Uzi, sniper, or just like a semi-auto. This is important because certain spells can synergize with certain gun types. For example, a shotgun build that benefits off of like close range combat would synergize best with like using the dash or the ground stomp to get close and pop enemies. It will probably cost a lot of energy, but you wouldn't have to worry about accuracy or anything. Or if you want to prioritize your accuracy, you can go for a sniper build augmented with a levitation spell. Now, levitation is generally the best spell in the game, and when you finally unlock it, that's when like the true power fantasy comes to life, because like you really get a feel for like how Jesse has scaled into the game. You basically become like Jean Grey from X-Men. His playstyle would revolve around using Levy to find decent positioning and pop enemies from long range, never having to endanger yourself with anything and just solely relying on accuracy while flying. As for me personally, I went with the DPS approach with the Uzi. Now, I seldom ever used the shield and relied mostly on just like using the dash to reposition myself while just ripping through tankier mobs first, and then use the launch spell to like buy myself some time. It actually reminded me of playing my main Lucian in League of Legends, which was a nice bit of nostalgia. As far as enemy diversity goes, I know some people have a bit of a problem with it, but I generally think it's alright. I wish there were more unique combat situations available because a lot of it felt like pretty telegraphed. Like you would walk in and you would know like enemies would pop out at this juncture, which like kinda like I would have liked a little bit more surprise in how the combat triggered, but the enemy variety was something I was fine with for the most part. The further you progress, the more you start running into enemies who start to have your abilities as well, so you have to find a way to get through their shield and aim accordingly since they can also dash while flying. The mobs you face in the end are especially tough, and they can seriously cause some problems when they start spawning as groups, and you need to get like real methodical when you deal with them. I would say guys, perhaps the only downside to the combat in Control is that there isn't enough true boss encounters. I was pretty hyped seeing the first one in the game, and I thought this would be like a sign of things to come, but unfortunately that was pretty much the first and last time there was like an actual real boss encounter. Like I mentioned earlier, like the game ends without having like a good final fight against like a hiss-infested Dylan, which I thought was like a huge problem with like putting a cap on the whole game, and it permeated throughout the whole playthrough as well. It would have been nice to have these kind of encounters to really provide some sort of like narrative capstone on a particular arc. I noticed that the big boss fights were essentially just like super mobs but with bigger health bars, and they didn't really have any sort of like unique movesets to really punctuate the encounter and feel like I've earned something after beating them. Having at least a few bosses with unique movesets and dedicated cutscenes would have honestly even helped the plot with all of its problems and like provided big checkpoints as the story unfolded. But other than that guys, the combat in Control is like fun as hell and certainly the best part about it, so 9 out of 10. Coming straight from the combat, let's cover the progression and systems within the game. And this is where things go from great to back down to not so great. First off, let's get the good out of the way. The general build expression is fucking fantastic. The game has cleverly disguised quite a deep and intricate web of builds and playstyles behind just a few guns and spells. The combat system never comes off bloated, and that's a credit to the efficient systemization that was built around just like a few gun modifications and psychonetic spells. And speaking of the psychonetic spells, this is probably the biggest draw to the game. Just flying around chucking shit at zombies like Jean Grey is really addictive. Every spell that you get has a unique function within the playthrough, and the game does a fantastic job of making you feel stronger as you progress through the plot. But this is only true from a spell's perspective. From a weapon's perspective, it's dog shit. The upgrade mechanics for your guns aren't just scaled poorly, but also communicated poorly. For the longest time, I thought I could only upgrade one gun at a time, even if I never used it, because the interface doesn't show all unlocked guns. It just shows the ones that you can upgrade, and I was just like, well, I don't want to just like waste resources on a gun that I'll never use. Secondly, the overall progression of these guns are just like bad. I primarily used the Uzi for my playthrough, and I was stuck with the level 1 version of it for like 60% of my playthrough. Then randomly after finishing a quest, the level 2 and level 3 upgrades just suddenly became available, so I maxed it out and never touched the upgrade system again for the rest of the playthrough. This upgrade cadence is pretty shit because I was left wondering where the hell my upgrades were going to come through, especially since the option itself is like unavailable for like the first 15 hours. This combination of poor upgrade cadence and poor upgrade visibility was quite annoying, and it really felt like jagged throughout my whole playthrough. Like I honestly didn't know what the fuck was going on. But perhaps my biggest problem with the game is the economy and material bloat. There is just way too much random shit that you have to pick up, and that creates friction when you eventually run out of room and have to start like dismantling them. The game has both weapon and personal mods with 5 different tiers, which is fine, but the problem is they're all individually separate mods. So you end up with the same kind of mod across like all 5 different tiers in your inventory, and every 30 minutes out of your playthrough, you have to pause and do some house cleaning, which was like really annoying and immersion breaking. I would have liked it if you initially picked up the lowest tier of these mods during like your first 10 hours, and the rest of the game is just spent upgrading the ones you want to max level. You can even smooth out this mod progression by getting them behind plot progression so the mods scale neatly with stronger enemies. The game also has this weird gacha thing where you can empty resources into it, and it allows you to craft like random higher tier mods, but that shit was completely useless. You get plenty of mods from just like exploring the world and fighting, that system never becomes useful. I just like for the sake of it, I upgraded to like level 5 just to see what it was, and I haven't used it a single fucking time. The skill tree itself is pretty basic, nothing to really write home about. It is expensive to respec, which I found annoying, but I didn't really have much of a problem with it since the spell upgrades are nice and isn't really necessarily mandatory for beating the higher tier mobs. That's one thing good about the game, I guess. It's that it's more reliant on like simple positioning, aim, reaction speed, so it doesn't really stat check you. You can sort of like skill your way through it. One thing I noticed that was actually a really good implementation with the control was how the healing works. After you kill them, mobs drop these tiny blue marbles that you can walk over to and heal yourself. If you're like the vast majority of people and playing a somewhat ranged build, then there will be often times where the health marbles will be quite far away from you, and which can get really tricky to pick up if you take like a sniper bullet or a rock to the face in the middle of the combat. So this creates a very interesting minigame where you have to strategically maneuver around the battlefield and pick up these health marbles. It's a double-edged sword because you need those health marbles the lower you get, but that's also when you're most susceptible to getting flatlined by like a completely random stray bullet. Off the top of my head, I think God of War is the only game where I've seen this kind of like position-based healing, and I think Control does the best job of it out of like basically any game I've ever played. The combat is already peak, but having this kind of like healing mechanic in the middle of the fast-paced combat is really fucking good, so massive props to the team for that. Overall guys, I think I'll split it down the middle and give the progression systems a 5 out of 10. They nailed the build diversity and spell progression as well as adding this nifty little healing dynamic within the game, but Control ultimately drops the ball when it comes to the bloat of the mod economy, the obscure gun progression, and the random and completely useless mod gacha system. To wrap up with the game design, let's discuss the overall world design in Control. Now, the game does some pretty impressive things here with the overall world design. Like I mentioned earlier, it has this very brutalist architecture style that was done beautifully, and it helped convey the stability and structure that's supposed to represent the FPC. It also has this unintended benefit of making the whole playthrough feel strangely claustrophobic, which is a really nice touch for immersing yourself into the story. The whole playthrough happens inside the building that makes you feel cut off from the rest of the world. Honestly guys, this kind of world immersion is probably the best thing about Control. You're always wrestling with this eerie, barren, and mysterious vibe for your whole playthrough. And you like always got your hand on the trigger every time you turn a corner because you never know what kind of hit zombie might be waiting for you. Ultimately, I think the game kind of fumbles this awesome tension it creates by not leaning more into the Dark Souls gimmick of like planting surprise attacks all throughout the levels. Actually, the more I think about it, I feel like this guy took the worst parts about Dark Souls and skipped over like the actually good ones. Even though I would have hated that shit in the moment, constantly threatening the players with cheap sneak attacks from zombies would have created like a light horror element to the game and would have really powered up the Hiss infestation theme, so I was kinda sad not to see it implemented. But overall, the world design and immersion is solid. Where the game falls apart though is all the side content. So initially when I got the lay of the land after like the first 5 hours, I was thinking that this kind of close-knit setting would really benefit from like some intimate side quests where we take a lot of time exploring each character, their motives and personalities, all while being trapped inside this building. It's like the classic zombie apocalypse stuff, and it would have actually served the game quite nicely. But we didn't get any of that. Instead of character building side quests, all we got was like a bunch of random bullshit quicktime events centered around like cleaning up random mob outbreaks and getting dogshit rewards after you complete them. A lot of the side quest premise just feel random and disconnected, and I was like never really incentivized to try them because of the shitty rewards. And speaking of rewards, the general exploration of the building was also pretty bad. Aside from like finding mods and upgrade mats, there isn't really much you can gain from exploring. Like I said earlier, all the random case files and tape recordings are just really flavor text disguised as important plot points. Aside from like 4 or 5 of them, I literally forgot everything else that was on the case files because they were just meaningless wastes of time. So yeah, while the world is built beautifully and nails the creepy, foreboding aesthetic, there isn't really a way to interact with it other than doing like basic bitch kill quests or picking up loot in boxes. So it's a bit somewhat disappointing, so I'm going to give this a 5 out of 10. We're almost at the end of our review as we come up on the subjective side of things, starting with quality of life. Now, I suppose I've already ranted about how bloated the upgrade mat system was, so I guess the biggest thing I would have liked to see is some sort of like auto dismantle feature. If, for whatever reason, the devs wanted to keep the mat drops the way they were, they should have added an auto dismantle feature that got rid of all the mats below a certain tier threshold. This would have streamlined it for players, and they would have only had to pick between the highest tier mods available and not waste time just like deleting useless shit for their inventory. Another thing I wasn't really a fan of was the map design. I found it very confusing and it didn't do a very good job of like separating between the different floors, and I was constantly getting confused and wasting time just figuring out like what elevation I was in and what elevation I'm supposed to get to. Like that part was like very murky and not easily understandable with the map layout as it was. And moving on to things I liked, I guess I generally appreciated the auto reload feature. The gun automatically reloads either when it runs out or when you're not using it, which was a really smooth touch in the middle of combat. I feel like you can just pause and weigh your options in the middle of a fight and the gun will automatically reload itself in the meantime, which is like good for setting the pace in some of like the more tricky fights. But generally speaking guys, I think the quality of life is just something the game does thankfully very well, and I don't have like much to take off from here. It isn't too pedantic and doesn't pad runtime with like too many useless gimmicks and annoyances aside from the mod bloat, so I'm happy giving this section a 7 out of 10. And wrapping up with my overall enjoyment playing the game, I think this might be surprising for some of y'all, but I'm going to give Control a 3 out of 10. Unlike something like Gothic Remake, which I took great pleasure in tearing to shreds, I actually kind of feel bad for this game. It has such an interesting premise and phenomenal combat gameplay, but it just has like so many holes.
Pause.
The facial jank, the fumbling of the narrative payoffs, the frankly ugly color grading, and just like the dull exploration made my experience playing this game really shit for like most of my playthrough. The game really fancies itself a Dark Souls in terms of like storytelling, but ultimately leaves way too many things up to interpretation, which basically renders the plot kind of like empty and bare bones for the most part. I finished the game thinking that there were like so many things left unresolved, and even if they were resolved, it felt like they were done with like such cheap, rushed writing so the plot can just like reach some semblance of a finished conclusion. Like for example, I still cannot figure out how Jessie just simply like finds Polaris inside of her. There is nothing in the case files or anything in any of the scenes that would have indicated that a piece of Hedron would have survived inside Jessie, and it's like even more maddening because we don't even know what the hell Hedron or Polaris is. So to God, guys, by the time I was finishing the endgame, I was frantically rushing through the plot beat so I can just finish the fucking game and end my misery. I feel like playing Control was like a really long shift at work. Control commits the cardinal sin of not necessarily being a bad game, but rather a boring game that relies heavily on its combat to hide the rest of its subpar design. I can give it points for trying many different things and frankly getting close and delivering a compelling experience, but it just falls short. And given the nature of the story it's trying to tell and the high degree of execution required to make it work, the game just feels like a massive fucking waste of time. That's like the primary reason I'm never going to play this game again, and I don't plan on playing the sequel until I see like some massive props for that game from like other people. So yeah, rant out of the way, let's wrap up the scores. Plot, 4 out of 10. Characters, 5 out of 10. Voice acting, 9 out of 10. Visuals, 4 out of 10. Music, 5 out of 10. Combat, 9 out of 10. Progression systems, 5 out of 10. World design, 5 out of 10. Quality of life, 7 out of 10. And overall enjoyability, 3 out of 10. Which gives Control a total score of 56 out of 100, and it ranks squarely in the average category. I hope this video was helpful for you guys to at least gain a little bit of understanding of the game. Y'all can decide for yourselves if you want to give the game or the sequel a shot. From what I see from the sequel, it should address a lot of the mysteries that were left unaddressed in the game, so I would definitely recommend picking it up if you're a fan of the game for whatever reason. As for me personally, I really started losing interest about halfway through the playthrough and only bothered to finish it so I can make this review for you guys. And if you're someone who's already played the game, tell me what you think. Do you think I'm being fair in my review? What scores would you give to each of my categories? Let me know what you think. And while you're down in the comments, like the video to boost it to other people who might also be looking for a Control review before the sequel comes out, and subscribe to catch more of my reviews in this exact same style. I'll leave you guys with my full Raybees Reviews playlist here. That's it from me in this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.